I think the Eurozone is a complete disaster, and I'm not a Johnny-come-lately on this subject. I was saying it right from the beginning. And the problem is really, it's twofold. Firstly, you've got these countries on the southern periphery, Greece, of course, the most intense example, but also Italy, Spain and Portugal, which are uncompetitive. In the past, they would have depreciated their exchange rates, and that would have kept them in the game, essentially. They can't do that. So they're mired in a dreadful situation, low GDP, huge unemployment. Greece has lost 25% of its GDP during the last 6 or 7 years. I mean, horrendous, really horrendous. That's problem number one. But the second aspect is it's not fully appreciated, and it is, I think, at least as important. And that is the tendency for Germany and the Netherlands, and some other countries, but mainly those two, to do too much saving. They run their policies too tightly. The German companies sell sort of wonderful stuff across Europe and across the world, and then the income received from that is not fully spent. Now, in the days of, this is vital to the euro, it's right at the centre of the euro question. In the days before the euro, when the Deutschmark was in existence, the Germans were just as German then. They were wonderful engineering and exporting and making things, they worked jolly hard, all that stuff. And they had a natural tendency to run up surpluses, to save too much then. But the currency stopped that tendency from being fully realised. They would do all this non-spending and working, and up would go the Deutschmark. And that would attenuate these tendencies to be able to export a lot. And so it's the combination of those two things. So what the euro has done is it's locked together these two groups of countries that behave fundamentally differently. And in the old days, the exchange rate acted as a flex, a hinge, enabling those two sorts of countries to work together. Without it, well, you've got this ghastly stagnation.
So without the common currency, if we just had a European Union without a common currency, could that have lasted? Could that have worked better?
Oh, I think it would have worked much better. I mean, most of what's wrong in the European Union at the moment is, I think, the euro. But if you look at the historical record, it's quite clear that Europe was not doing that well before the euro came into existence. I mean, the gaps aren't huge, but they're there. Go back far enough, of course, right from the beginning, the European Union was very successful, which is the real reason why Britain joined. Those countries from the late 50s into the 60s, early 70s were growing very fast, and we thought this was a miracle economic era and we better hitch ourselves to that wagon. And then more or less, as soon as we joined, funny enough, the relative growth performance started to deteriorate, because of course the 70s were grim for Britain. Come the 80s, we started to improve, the continent started to do a bit worse, and then we got the emerging markets growing very strongly. And throughout the last 20 or 30 years, the performance of the Eurozone compared to other countries around the world has been deteriorating.
And in terms of countries possibly leaving the euro, you're not particularly concerned about Greece, are you? But you're rather concerned about some of the other peripheral nations.
Well, I think for Greece to leave, it's a huge step, of course. I think it would be a good thing for Greece. If I were advising the Greek government, I would advise them to do precisely that.
Because you have to wonder who is advising them not to.
Well, I think this is actually largely political, really. I mean, very often, you know, people say to me, why is it that the Greek government or the Greek people don't want to leave the euro? And I say to them, I think this is a bit like the economic equivalent of Stockholm syndrome. In the world of psychology, apparently there's this phenomenon where someone's held captive in a cave, as it were, or a cage. They strike up a relationship with their captor, and then after so many months of all this, when the door is open, they don't want to leave. Well, I think this is a bit like that. If you go back in history, you hardly ever find a case where a country locked in an unfavourable exchange rate regime wants to leave. Britain, 1992, forced out of the ERM. What happens? I mean, the newsreaders that night, September the 16th, 1990, they're practically wearing black armbands. You know, oh, business surveys, business optimism collapsed, consumers are depressed, people are putting keys through the letterboxes, you know, it was all falling apart. In fact, of course, we now know that was the beginning of our escape from recession. Now,